And hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. I really appreciate your attendance. And I see we have 18 people now. That's really great. As Linda said, if you have any questions, please just write them down, send them in, and we'll address all of them at the end. This webinar is called Made to Stick: How to Choose the Right Sealants for Your Masonry Project. As Linda said, my name is Art Fox. I'm the Marketing and Communications Manager for Motornet Solutions. And Motornet Solutions is the leader in moisture management products and systems for masonry walls. Motornet Solutions introduced the original Motornet mortar dropping collection device over 20 years ago, and we've been helping masons create dry and long-lasting walls ever since. Now, please note this webinar is copyrighted, but as I think Linda mentioned, it is being recorded, and it will be available for you to watch or download on the MCAA website, and we'll also have a copy of it on the Motornet Solutions website at motornet.com. Excuse me. Okay, well, let's get started. This is the overview. And sealants are a small but extremely important part of the building envelope. So in this webinar, we'll take a look at how to make sure you choose the right sealants for your project and that you use them correctly. We'll look at how sealants differ from caulking and why it's important to use sealants and not caulking in masonry projects. We'll take a look at the advantages and disadvantages of polyurethane and silicone, two of the most commonly used sealants, and at modified polyether, which is a new type of sealant that combines benefits of both. We'll also look at butyl sealant. That's a very important sealant type that works in a lot of situations where modified polyether and many other sealants don't perform as well. And then we'll finish up with a look at how to prevent sealant failure. So let's look first at the differences between caulkings and sealants. Now, the name caulking and sealant are often used interchangeably, but they're not the same. Caulking is a term that's usually applied to products used in indoor applications in non-moving joints with movement capabilities of no more than 12%. And I know they're called non-moving joints, but actually they do move a little bit, but very little. Most are designed to be paintable. They come in a wide range of colors to match paints and materials, and many of them are water-based, and that makes them easy to tool and easy to clean up. Sealants, on the other hand, are a very different story. For exterior use on both, both residential and commercial structures, sealants are definitely the way to go. And some of their advantages over caulking include that sealants can exhibit considerable movement without losing adhesion, between 25 and 50%, and sometimes even more depending on the formulation. And there is very little shrinkage as they cure. Commercial sealants, like MPE1 modified polyether and BTL butyl from Motornet Solutions, exhibit extremely strong adhesion to many of the slick membranes and porous materials found on today's masonry projects. And when sealants are used to fill joints, the width to depth ratio is typically 2 to 1. The width for polyurethanes is never less than 3/8 of an inch, and for silicones, it should never be less than 1/4 of an inch. For both, the depth should never be greater than 1/2 inch. Excuse me. For joints where it's necessary to use backer rods or other type of joint filler, bond breakers should be used to create the 2 to 1 width to depth ratio and to allow the materials at the joint to move in 2 dimensions only. This is really important. 3-dimensional movement or triaxial stress can cause premature joint failure. So the bottom line is both caulking and sealants are designed to seal expansion and control joints and to join materials together. But only sealants should be used on commercial and residential building exteriors, especially masonry building exteriors. The sealants are used in exterior masonry construction to create watertight, airtight seals between similar or dissimilar materials. For example, today's sealants are being used to seal flashing membrane laps around penetrations that extend through flashing membranes like the one you see here in this pipe penetration through a total flash flashing system panel. They're also used to seal under drip edges, at corner boots and end ends, and behind termination bars. So now what I'd like to do is ask everybody a quick question here. And you'll have about 30 seconds to answer. How familiar were you before this section with the difference between caulking and sealant? And you'll see a timer on your screen. So go ahead and enter your answer, either extremely familiar, somewhat familiar, or not at all familiar. Okay, we've had 30 seconds pass, 67, 2/3 of you have voted. If anybody else wants to vote, please go ahead and do that. Okay, that's 45 seconds. We'll go ahead and close the poll. Thank you very much for filling out those poll questions. And here are the answers. 67, or 2/3 of you, said that you were somewhat familiar with it, and 1/3 of you said you weren't at all familiar with it. So again, thanks for answering those questions. All right. Now, let's take a look at the advantages and disadvantages of a couple of the most commonly used sealant types, starting with silicone. Now, silicones have a long life expectancy of 10 to 35 years and good weatherability, so they resist damage from UV, ozone, and temperature extremes. They retain their flexibility so they can move as building materials move, and they're quick curing, usually fully cured within 24 hours. However, they require moisture to catalyze the chemical curing process, so if the air is extremely dry, they may take longer. They have a soft feel when they're dry and excellent adhesive strength with the right materials. Now, there are a lot of different types, so you need to be sure to read the labels to see what each type is best, which type is best used for your application. But in spite of their advantages, silicones also have a couple of disadvantages: volatile organic compounds, or VOC emissions, and toxicity. Silicone sealants use a variety of curing agents, but almost all exhibit relatively high VOCs and toxicity. The exception is silicones using an acetone curing agent. This type is relatively new, and it has a lower odor and lower VOCs. Now, it's important to evaluate the compatibility of silicones with the type of masonry and other materials you're using. For example, silicones exhibit poor adhesion with plastics like PVC and EPDM, and silicones will typically lose their oil when applied to porous stone and concrete, and they can stain soft stone, but they are excellent with hard stones like marble and granite. Okay, well, let's do another poll question here. So how familiar were you with the advantages and disadvantages of silicone sealant? So go ahead and answer that. Okay, coming up on 30 seconds here. And 45 seconds coming up. Looks like almost 80% of you have voted. All right, so we'll go ahead and close the poll. And let's look at the results here. Looks like 7% of you are extremely familiar with silicones, 53% somewhat familiar, and 40% not at all familiar. Okay, let's move on. and talk about polyurethanes. In addition to silicone, polyurethane has been one of the best performing sealants available. And these types of sealants are paintable once they're fully cured, but that can take as long as 7 days. And they have minimal shrinkage as they cure. They're made in single and multiple component formulas, and they're compatible with most masonry types, and are non-staining. So let's do another quick poll question here about polyurethanes. How familiar were you with the advantages and disadvantages of polyurethane sealants? Okay, coming up on 30 seconds here, 71% of you have voted. So we'll take another 10 seconds or so, ask everybody to finish their voting. Okay, looks like everybody's voted, so let's go ahead and take a look at the results. And you can see that 6% of you were extremely familiar, 59% somewhat familiar, and a little over a third of you not at all familiar. Okay, let's move on to our next slide. As good as silicones and polyurethanes are, there are 2 sealants available now that can handle almost any type of masonry project, but without many of the downsides of the silicones and polyurethanes. And they are modified polyether and butyl. The modified polyether is a relatively new type of sealant, and it will adhere to almost all common masonry building materials. It has the positive characteristics of polyurethanes and silicones without their undesirable qualities. They have an increased ability to adhere to many of today's construction membranes and masonry materials, and they're an excellent choice for many expansion and control joints. However, modified polyether won't stick to roofing and flashing materials such as TPO or EPDM. So a butyl sealant is also necessary for adhering TPO and EPDM to other materials and to themselves. Butyl is intended for concealed applications only. Now, between them, these sealants are ideal for many kinds of sealant applications on masonry projects. So let's take a little bit deeper look into these 2 categories of sealants. Modified polyether sealants like MPE1 are the next generation of sealants, and they combine the best properties of silicone and polyurethane. For example, MPE1 modified polyether sealant is extremely flexible without losing adhesion to the substrate, and it exhibits excellent cohesion. Now, cohesion is how well a sealant sticks to itself, or put another way, how much it resists tearing internally. In fact, testing shows that MPE1 can be stretched 25–50% without losing cohesion. MPE1 doesn't need a primer and is a 1-part sealant, so it can be used right out of the tube. Now, because very little moisture is required to trigger rapid curing, it can be used in dry climates, plus moisture contamination doesn't cause outgassing damage like it can with some urethanes. It skins over rapidly, and it's virtually unaffected by rain. It can be applied in temperatures as low as 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and it has excellent gunability, even at low temperatures. MPE1 is approved as a general-purpose sealant. It withstands stringent weathering and retains its long-term elasticity and bonding properties over time without significant changes, plus it is paintable after curing. It's non-staining, and its adhesion is much better than urethanes and equal to the best silicones. And very importantly, is one of the most environmentally and OSHA-compliant sealants on the market today. It has very low volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, so it can safely be used in enclosed spaces and will not outgas. It contains no carcinogenic material, and it does conform to LEED requirements. So let's take a look at another poll. How familiar were you with the advantages and disadvantages of modified polyether sealant? Okay, coming up on 30 seconds. Looks like about 2/3 of you have voted so far. So if you're going to vote, please go ahead and put in your answer. Okay, coming up on 45 seconds here. About 2/3 of you have voted. If anybody else wants to vote, I'll give you another couple of seconds, but it looks like that's going to be it for this question. No, one other person. Okay. Another couple of people. Great. All right, we'll close that poll and take a look at the results. Looks like 7% of you were extremely familiar with it, 27% somewhat familiar, but 2/3 of you not at all familiar with it. Good. Glad we were able to provide you with some new information. Okay. Now let's talk about butyl for a second. Butyl sealants are necessary for those applications where polyether sealants won't work. So Modern Solutions created BTL1 butyl sealant to complement the MPE1 modified polyether. Now all butyl sealants are synthetic rubber derived from butane. They are, and that's why they're called butyl sealants. They are impermeable to gases and moisture, and they are the most waterproof of the sealants. Butyl sealants like BTL1 bond with all types of masonry, steel, glass, concrete, fiberglass, plastic, metal, extruded styrene, foam insulation, flashings made of kynar-coated metal, flashing membranes made of thermoplastic polyolefin or TPO, and ethylene propylene diene monomer or EPDM. When using butyl to fill joints, it can be used in a 1-to-1 width to depth ratio, with the joint being at least 1/4 inch wide by 1/4 inch deep. But because it never fully sets, unlike MPE1, butyl, including BTL1, should never be used in vertical or exposed joints because it will sag out of the joints. It must only be used in concealed applications. And because they're always tacky, none of the butyl sealants will smooth very well. And that's unimportant when they're used to join materials together, where they're applied in a situation where you never see the sealant. A key characteristic of butyls like BTL1 is that they're non-hardening and they're permanently flexible. And that's why they stand up extremely well in applications where there will always be movement between the joined pieces. And BTL1 is a single component butyl that is used right out of the tube. It's moisture cured, it doesn't require a primer, but it and all butyl sealants require xylene or paint thinner for cleanup rather than water. Now MPE1, you can clean that up with water. Finally, BTL1 has extremely low VOCs, and it is odor-free, so it too can be used in enclosed spaces. Okay, let's take a look at our next poll question here. How familiar were you with the advantages and disadvantages of butyl sealant? So go ahead and answer that question. Okay, 30 seconds gone. 70% of you have voted. Anybody else wants to vote? Go ahead and do that. Okay, another person voted there. Anybody else want to vote? Give it another couple of seconds here. Okay, great. 75% of you voted. And here's the results of that poll. 6% of you were extremely familiar with butyl, 44% somewhat familiar, and half of you were not at all familiar. Okay, so let's take a look now at how to prevent sealant failure. So to review our definitions, there are two types of sealant failures. Adhesion failure is where the sealant stops sticking to the substrate. And in the upper part of the picture, you can see my pointer right here. In the upper part of the picture, you can see an example of adhesion failure where the sealant is pulled away from the masonry. And by the way, this image is of precast concrete, but it's only for illustration purposes of the types of sealant failure you might see in the field. MPE1, BTL1, and the other sealants we talked about are applicable for many applications beyond precast. Now, cohesion failure is where the sealant stops sticking to itself. In other words, it tears apart internally. And in the lower part of this picture right here, you can see an example of cohesion failure where the sealant bead has pulled apart internally. Cohesion failure like this is frequently due to the application of a sealant bead that's too thin or the result of triaxial stress, a condition in which the sealant is pulled in 3 directions at once. The sealant failure can let water into the building, can ruin its appearance, and generate expensive repair costs. But preventing sealant failure isn't that difficult. First, you always start by using tested and proven sealants like MPE1 and BTL1. Next, make sure to match the sealant with the materials it's being applied to. Make sure the substrate surfaces are properly prepared. Surfaces should be clean, they should be free of dust and loose particles, they should be frost-free, and they should be free of oils and moisture. And never clean surfaces with oil-based solvents that leave a residue, or with soaps or detergents that leave a film, or with contaminated rags or wipes. And also never use soap or water to tool the joints. And when using sealants to fill joints, make sure the joints aren't too wide or deep, and that the sealant is applied in the proper width to depth ratio. And also use a bond breaker at any joint filler to avoid triaxial stress. And finally, don't use material that's past its shelf life. Check the use-by date on the tube. 10 to 24 months from date of manufacture is typical. And make sure, and you can see that for MPE1, shelf life is 10 months. For butyl, it's 24 months. And make sure the sealant hasn't been frozen or exceeded high temperature limits when it was in storage prior to use. Be sure to apply the sealants according to the manufacturer's directions. Now, for example, use urethane and silicone only at temperatures above 40 degrees. Now, you can use MPE1, modified polyether, down to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Make sure moisture conditions are appropriate. Silicones can outgas, and they can even foam if they get too much moisture. MPE1 skins over very rapidly, and it's virtually unaffected by moisture, assuming the substrate is dry when it's applied. And use primer when required, and if you're using a 2-part sealant, be sure to mix it thoroughly and in the right proportions before you apply it. Finally, make sure the bead size is continuous and big enough so that there are no voids in the bead, and that helps avoid the cohesion failure. Consult your sealant and materials manufacturers for additional recommendations and product information. Stephen Facchino, who some of you may know, he's the engineering and construction manager for Moyninet Solutions, and he's happy to answer any questions about our products and how to use them in your projects, and we'll give you his contact information at the end of the webinar. So let's look at a final poll question here. How familiar were you with the steps necessary to prevent sealant failure? Okay, almost 30 seconds, 70%, 75%, 78% have voted. Great. Give it another 10 or 15 seconds here. Make sure everybody gets a chance to vote on this final question. Okay, that should pretty much conclude that poll. So Here are the results from that poll. 17% of you are extremely familiar, 67% somewhat familiar, and 17% not at all familiar. So thanks again for voting on all these polling questions. It looks like we were able to provide you with some information that was useful and actionable for you. So let's go ahead and summarize what we've been talking about. Sealants and caulking are not the same. Excuse me. Caulking is fine for indoor use, but commercial grade sealants are the only way to go for exterior applications in commercial masonry projects. Make sure the sealants you choose are compatible with your project's material. Silicones and polyurethane sealants have been the go-to sealants for a long time, but a newer type of sealant, excuse me, a newer type of sealant, modified polyether, combines the best of both types. It has excellent adhesion and cohesion. It can be used at temperatures as low as 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Has excellent gunability, great weathering characteristics, a long life, and very low VOCs. MPE-1 is a modified polyether specifically formulated for masonry construction, and is designed to bond most types of common materials used in masonry construction. For flashing membranes like TPO and EPDM, use BTL1 butyl sealant, but remember, it should never be used in vertical or exposed joints. So between these two sealants, you'll be able to meet almost all of your sealant needs for lap joint conditions, where a lap joint is when two pieces of material overlap and are sealed together. So if you'd like to look at our how-to video showing how MPE-1 is part of the installation process for total flash, one-piece end dams, and our unique 14-inch high corner boots, you can just copy down the link here or click on it when you look at it on the website, or just visit our website at mortarnet.com and go to the FAQs and support tab. My name is Art Fox. I'm the Marketing and Communications Manager with Mortarnet. If you have questions or comments about this webinar, please email me at afox@mortarnet.com, and if you would, put sealant webinar in the subject line. And if you have technical questions, please email Stephen Facchino, our Engineering and Construction Manager, at sfacchino@mortarnet.com. And when you visit the Mortarnet website, be sure to check out our new Construction Services tab. And that is a new division of Mortarnet that is dedicated to helping contractors get superior service in all aspects of construction. So, thank you for attending our Made to Stick webinar. So let's go ahead and take some questions, and I'm going to back up so you can see our contact information in case you'd like to copy that.
We have some questions that we thought would be of interest to the group. The first question is, what is the best sealant for masonry brick sills?
I'm sorry,
The question again is, what is the best sealant for masonry brick sills?
Usually MPE-1 or a similar modified polyether sealant will be what you need. If you're talking about the space underneath the sill, you want something that's going to be UV resistant, and you also want something that's got a lot of expansion characteristics to it, so it can expand and contract as that sill moves around.
Okay, we have another question. One that is, what is the life expectancy of polyether?
Polyether and modified polyethers, it depends on how much UV exposure they get. Mortarnet MPE-1 is rated for up to 12 years if it's exposed, and it'll last a lot longer than that if it's not exposed. The best thing to do is check with the manufacturer. They do vary a bit, and it does depend on the conditions. For example, if you're in a really hot climate or a really cold climate, or if the sealant is going to be exposed to a lot of UV, you're going to get a shorter lifespan out of them. So there really is no one-size-fits-all answer. It'll depend on your conditions, but you can definitely expect 10 to 12 years minimum.
Okay, great. We have another question. It is, what is the best sealant for anchored natural limestone wall panels?
Are you talking about, well, assuming you're talking about the joints between the panels, MPE1 would be great for that, modified polyether. You definitely do not want to use a butyl for that, because a butyl, assuming they're going to be in a vertical installation, you never want to use butyl in a vertical joint because it'll sag out of the joint. But a modified polyether and many of the polyethers on the market will do a good job with that.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have another question. It said backer rods. You did not emphasize these. Is there anything important we should take away regarding backer rods?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that you need to be aware of with backer rods. Sorry, we didn't have time to spend much on those, but the purpose of a backer rod is generally to fill a gap so that you can get the 2-to-1 ratio that's usually required with most 2-to-1 width to depth ratio that is usually required for sealants. And the purpose of the backer rod is to fill that gap so you can get that ratio, but it's also, you want to use one that has a bond breaker on it. One of the reasons that sealants fail is because if you're joining two pieces of material together like that toward the concrete panels we saw in the presentation, those panels are going to move quite a bit due to thermal stress and settling in the building and that kind of thing. And if they only have to move in two directions, side to side and up and down, most of the modified polyethers, for example, Mortadent's MPE1, it will move well over 100% of its size without losing cohesion. But if you have a backer rod that is not a bond breaker, in other words, if the sealant sticks to the backer rod as well as the two pieces of material that it's attached to, that's when you get that cohesion failure that I mentioned. So you want to be sure to use backer rods that the sealant will not stick to.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have one more question that we wanted to share with the group. How does the life expectancy of polyether compare to silicone?
Silicone's a little bit longer. It depends a lot on the conditions under which they're applied. Thanks, everybody, for attending.